Welcome to the Yale Center for British Art, online series at home, Artists in Conversation. My name is Michele Robecchi. I'm an independent curator and writer and commissioning editor at Phaidon Press. And I am delighted to welcome Rachel Whiteread to our program today. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please be aware that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Rachel, and they will be answered at the end of the program if there is time. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the program. I also have to read a land acknowledgement. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantuket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shakticoke, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Nyanting, and the Kinipak and other Algonquian-speaking people have stewarded through generations the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. So we honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Rachel Whiteread, welcome. A brief introduction. Born in 1963 in Ilford, Essex, Whiteread is, as you all know, a very prominent British artist whose sculptures explore themes of absence, memory, permanence, and how surfaces bear the lingering presence of human hues. Whiteread studied painting at Brighton Polytechnic and received her MA in sculpture from the Slade School of Fine Art, University College in London. She was one of the young British artists, also known as YBAs. Her work was featured in the Sensation exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 1997. Whiteread is best known for creating casts of the negative spaces in and around ordinary objects, revealing hidden narratives and forgotten histories. Her early works transform intimate domestic items, beds, cabinets, hot water bottles, into haunting replicas, alluding to memories of their previous lives. Among Whiteread's most renowned works are House, 1993, concrete cast of the interior of an entire three-story Victorian home. The Judenplatz Holocaust Memorial, made in Vienna in 2000, also known as the Nameless Library for its row of books with closed pages facing the viewer, cast in concrete. And Untitled Monument, made in 2001, an 11-ton resin cast of the vacant Fort Plinth in London's Trafalgar Square. Her first public sculpture commissioned for display in the United States was called Water Tower. It was made in 1998, and it was a translucent resin cast of one of New York City's distinctive rooftop reservoirs installed against the skyline in Soho. In 1993, Whiteread was the first female winner of the annual Turner Prize. She was also the first woman to represent a solo exhibition at the British Pavilion during the Venice Biennale, where she was awarded Best Young Artist in 1997. The centerpiece of her display was a plaster cast encasing the empty space beneath 10 ordinary boardroom tables. Arranged to reference the difficult meetings Whiteread attended in Vienna when planning her Holocaust memorial, Untitled 10 Tables is now in the center's collection. Whiteread has exhibited widely in the US, including major exhibitions at the National Sculpture Center in Dallas and the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles in 2010, the National Gallery of Art in Washington in 2018, and the St. Louis Museum in Missouri in 2019. In 2006, Whiteread was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE, and in 2019, she received the honor of Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, DBE. Her works are in prominent collections internationally, including the Tate Gallery in London, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and the Yale Center for British Art, of course. Whiteread lives and works in London. And welcome, Rachel Whiteread. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you, Michele.
Thank you. So, Rachel, as I said in my introduction, you were trained as a painter, but we all know you as a sculptor. And I think it would be interesting to start with your first exhibition at the Carlyle Gallery in 1988. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. So as you explained, I started as a painter, and then I became a sculptor, sort of doing sculpture at the Slade. But at the time that I was at the Slade, I was never really able to make a kind of sculpture as such. Not that I think a sculpture as being something that sort of stands on its own and in the middle of a room, but for me, it was something that I still couldn't do. I was still sort of leaning things against the wall, and I had a kind of painterly feel of as to what I was doing, and the way in which things could always connected between the wall and the floor, which is something that I still do now, of course. But when I made my first piece, which was called Closet, for me, that was a kind of revelation. I felt very excited to be able to make this work, which was it was called Closet. It was a wardrobe cast from sort of utilitarian furniture that was made, sort of post-war utilitarian furniture. And all of these elements, so there's closet, mantle, and the bed, which was called Shallow Breath. It was all of the same sort of period of furniture. It was the kind of furniture that my grandparents had, and then my parents maybe had. And then it was also the furniture that when I first left home was the kind of furniture that I had in my sort of student accommodation in these sort of crappy flats that we lived in. So the first piece, Closet, was really about trying to sort of make a childhood experience solid. So it was about thinking about sitting inside a wardrobe and just hiding away and looking and seeing what was going on. And I wanted to sort of make the essence of that feeling apparent in the sculpture. So by casting this wardrobe, which was, I didn't really know how to cast. I mean, sort of done a bit of casting, but I didn't really know how to do it. And it was just simply a wardrobe, which I lay flat on its back, opened the doors, and essentially just sort of poured plaster in. It was a bit more complicated than that. And then I shut the doors, and the sort of magical curing process of plaster happened, and there was steam and alchemy. And then I got rid of the wood, and then I had this plaster interior of a wardrobe, which I then used black felt. I dried it all out and used black felt to cover the surface, so it becomes like a very sort of mute surface, and it feels like I described it as a sort of a black furry space. So this was really the first sculpture that I would say that I made. But the gallery that I showed in, it was a small gallery called the Carlisle Gallery, and it was a very sort of domestic space. So I had these three elements, but I also had another element called Torso, which was a hot water bottle, a cast hot water bottle, which is something that I've used time and time again over the years. But it was, for me, quite an important piece because, the four things really sort of came together to make almost like an installation, I suppose. But if I just go back to this slide, so there was mantle, which was included glass on top of it. So that's the glass that was from the original dressing table. And then this was called Shallow Breath. And this was made very soon after my father died. And it's the cast of the space underneath a bed.
Wow. 2 years later, you made Ghost on the occasion of your exhibition at the Chisenhale, which I remember was the first time your work was exhibited, not in a gallery, but in a public setting.
Yeah, so I was very lucky. As a young artist, art now in the UK it's very different the way things happen. Couldn't be more different. But then, it was a long time ago now. It was. People didn't have money. There wasn't loads of money around. There wasn't, there were studio spaces. You could get cheap studio spaces, but that was about it. And, you'd had to sort of really struggle to earn the money. So I worked kind of 3 or 4 days a week in order to be in the studio. And, it was a whole different process. But I was very fortunate to get this, it wasn't really a commission, but I asked, there was a woman called Emma Dexter who now runs the British Council, but she was the curator at Chisenhale, and she said, I'd love you to make something. So I said, great. And I thought about it and thought, I know what I want to do is actually make the space that would have surrounded those objects. So surrounded Shallow Breath, closet and, torso and mantle. So it took a while. I found the space that I could use, which had a very simple elements to it. It had a fireplace, it had cornicing, it had a door and a window. And so there I was casting it very hands-on. I thought about when I was making it, I was thinking about sort of how to construct something, but also how to compose something. And a lot of that came down to both the size of the object that I could physically lift, if you see here. So I was sort of manhandling all this stuff myself. But it also, I wanted it to do with, I was thinking about composition. I was thinking about a painter like Piero della Francesca, and thinking about how the things work, how the structure works in his paintings. So, these sorts of elements have always been part of the work. So it's always looking at painting and looking at, almost like painterly surfaces. So you think about the fireplace, managing to get the soot from the fireplace and, getting various sort of things to sort of come off the wall by using different kind of casting techniques. Or using different release agents, you could get different things. So around the light switch, for example, there would be sort of more marks. But as this piece has aged and it's now in the National Gallery in Washington, they own it, it really has even more patina of the sort of human touch, because people have been around for a long time now, so it has been touched. But when I made this, the main point about this, I think, was that when I had cast it and I put it up in my studio for the very first time, and I'd always been looking at the the construction of it. I hadn't really thought about what it was. I mean, I knew that when I was writing a proposal for it to get some money, I remember saying, I wanted to mummify the air in a room. That was something that was the sort of sentence that I used. And so I knew I'd gone to all this sort of trouble, and I'd just been making. And one day I walked into the studio, and it was sort of finally up, and it was early in the morning, the sun was coming in, and I saw the door, and I saw the door handle was turned inwards. So it was a hole, and the light switch was back to front. And I just thought, I am the wall. I have made this object, and I am the wall. And for me, that was a very kind of profound moment in why I'm saying this about both Closet and Ghost. These were very early works, but they have instructed my entire career, really. That it kind of stems from those things. The practice hasn't really changed that much, in that, from those very beginning pieces, were very, very early pieces.
And Ghost got a very strong response from the local community.
Yes, I mean, Ghost was, people loved it. And, Charles Saatchi, I don't know if people remember Charles Saatchi, but he wanted to buy it. It was a bit later on. He did buy it later on. Someone else bought it, and then it changed hands. It sold for £2,000, and then it changed hands and changed hands and changed hands. And, so I only ever made £2,000 from it, but I didn't even make that, I don't think, because I think I had to give half of it to someone else. So it wasn't a work of art that made me much money, but it was certainly something that was very instructive, the beginning of my career. And I may say so myself, it's a great piece of work.
Absolutely. And we have images actually of the piece in East London. There it is. And I do remember you said that once you spot a group of people trying to vandalize it.
Sorry, that was not, you're talking about how you said Ghost.
House.
House.
I'm going to House, of course.
A house. Yeah. So House, obviously, that after making Ghost, curator James Lingwood, who had recently taken over the sort of the role of director along with Michael Morris at Art Angel, came to the studio and just said, is there anything that you want to do? Is there anything that you'd like to make? And I sort of looked at him and said, well, actually, yes, I'd like to make an entire house. I'd like to cast an entire house. And he said, okay, let's do it. And, for me, that was kind of fantastic. Obviously, I'd made a little bit of work in between, but, he just said, yes, let's do it. And that was an extraordinary moment for a young artist to then, this was made in 92, 93, and Ghost was made in, I think, 89. So there was 3 years in between.
90.
So it took a long time to make house. We had to find the right site, which was this here, which was part of this road, Grove Road. At one end was a park called Victoria Park, and at the other end of the street, essentially, it was what was really the sort of pinnacle of Thatcher's Britain. You could see Canary Wharf and all of these new buildings that were, had been put up, and it was her idea that there would be this sort of corridor going from one end to the other, and it would be this great sort of capitalist extension. And part of this was that there were a lot of houses here along this whole row that were there, and they all got torn down. So there were all council tenants that lived in them, and they were all torn down in order to make a park. So there was a man called Mr. Gale and his family that still lived in that house, and they refused to move because they didn't want to get put into a council flat. So he was there for a very long time, and eventually he did get put into a nice little Victorian house, and we were able to take this house, and we had to lease it from the council, and we made house, or I made house, which is the concrete cast of an entire house, which caused an awful lot of furore. There was in the House of Commons, there were papers about it. There was everybody was sort of up in arms one way or another, and people were very intrigued by it. There was no Banksy then. There was none of this sort of controversy around art, and this was really, it became a very sort of controversial thing. And it was amazing, and it stood there for, I think, in the end, it was up for 3 months, and we had to pay extra time to keep it up, because there was one particular man who was from the local council who wanted it torn down because he said it was the gentrification of the area, and it was just getting the chattering classes to come and look at this diabolical object. And he managed to he had this little sort of mantra, and he managed to get it sort of torn down as quickly, rather than, we couldn't get this extension that we were trying to get. So politically, it was a very interesting story. There's a great book that Phaidon made at the time. It tells the whole story. I think you can kind of get it on eBay and, whatever, but maybe Phaidon might still have a few copies, who knows?
And we do. We do.
You do.
Well, I mean, some people wanted to tear it down. Some people wanted to make it permanent.
Yes, absolutely. People wanted to make it permanent. Charles Saatchi wanted to buy it and put it on wheels and take it over to his place over in North London. And there was all sorts of sort of ideas of what to do with it. And I thought the most dignified thing for it would be to just let it go, which is what we did. Because at the end of it, there was sort of graffiti all over first of all, there was graffiti at the side that said, "Homes for all, black and white," something like that. And then someone wrote, "What for? Why not?" And we had a bit of a battle trying to get, to stop people doing the graffiti, because we just didn't want it to become this sort of billboard for graffiti. But it just became a losing battle in the end. I went there at 3:00 one morning and managed to stop people from putting graffiti on it. But it was just everybody had their say, and that's how it was. And this is what the park looks like now. There's nothing there.
There's nothing there. Yes.
Nothing there.
Far from where I am right now. The first time I saw your work was at the Venice Biennale in 1997. I was an art student at the time, and it made a big impression on me, especially the dialogue that you established with the architecture of the pavilion. At the time, of course, I wasn't aware of the fact that part of the exhibition was reflecting another work you were in the process of making, which was the memorial in Vienna.
Yeah. It was when I was asked to do the Biennale, I was in the middle of trying to make the memorial happen, and it was really, really difficult. And I was actually really struggling to, just to keep my sanity, sort of trying to do it, because I really wanted to make the Holocaust Memorial, but there were enormous amount of changes in government, and there was, quite frankly, a lot of political unrest, and there was a great deal of sort of right-wing endeavor going on, and far right-wing endeavor going on, and I was trying to sort of, obviously, I was kind of beating my head against that, and they were saying it has to move somewhere else. Anyway, it was very, very frustrating, and I spent an awful long time going backwards and forwards and dealing with bureaucracy. But in a moment of calm in the pavilion, there was at the back of the pavilion, there is these windows and there's a canal, and I'd been sort of casting spaces underneath the floor, and I decided to do one of these in resin to try to somehow make the canal seem sort of solid. So obviously Venice is, all canals, so that sort of worked very well with the light. I was also at that time making a lot of work using resin, and that was partly because all of the other work that I'd made before was solid, and it was plaster and concrete, and it was very unforgiving surface. So what I was trying to investigate was looking inside, as well as having the underside of objects, which is these are chairs, but I also wanted to get inside that space. So it was a sort of playing with the sort of weight and color and interior of objects as well.
Right. As I said in my introduction, you were the first woman to have a solo show at the British Pavilion. Were you aware at the time of how consequential was that moment in history?
Well, at the time, I knew Bridget Riley had had an exhibition there, but it wasn't solo. So, she was with somebody else. So I kind of knew that it was a sort of big deal. And I was just thought how ridiculous that this hasn't happened before. And I, as you can imagine, I kind of took it in my stride, but it was a great experience to do that. And it was also at a time before the art world had gone mad, as it seems to have done now. So it was, there was still, the Venice Biennale. Now there are biennales all over the world. There are art fairs all the time. It's just this constant kind of information and art. So, but the Venice Biennale, it was almost like the kind of Olympics of art at the time. And
right.
And it felt very, very special. And yeah, I very much enjoyed doing it.
And the Holocaust monument in Vienna was eventually made in 2000. Is that correct? Like 2 years later?
Yes, yeah. But still, it was just this constant battle. It just went on and on and on. And actually, whilst I was there, I had to have a meeting with the president of Austria, and just somewhat, there were all these people there for the Biennale, and they thought, oh, this will be a good time for Rachel to add to her stress and have another meeting. So it was kind of like that. And anyway, whilst all this was going on, I'd been thinking about books, and obviously that was my idea for the memorial. And here, this is a drawing that I'd made for a piece that was going to be in the one of the rooms in the Venice Biennale. So this is sort of like the opposite of the library that I was making for the Holocaust Memorial. So these are all cast books, and they completely lined the room. So it was actually on all four walls.
Right.
So, it's just that this is how I kind of work. I sort of worry things through, sometimes on a very big scale, sometimes on a very small scale. But, it was like scratching an itch, because I just couldn't get this thing made, and it was just desperately frustrating.
Yeah, it's really interesting to learn about the connection between the two pieces after all this time.
Yeah.
I really had no idea when I went to see the show, which I loved.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this was 10 tables that I made, which was, again, looking at, I'd been casting tables before, and but it wasn't until going to the Biennale that I thought, actually, I can use this in a way so it looks kind of architectural, and it also looks a bit like the kind of bunker structure that I was making for the Holocaust Memorial, which of course when I got the commission, no one really thought of it as being a bunker, which was what I was sort of thinking of it as being.
Right.
So something that was, so it was a kind of criticism, it was a library, but it was also a kind of criticism of, obviously what had gone on during that period. So
and
this
the Holocaust Memorial was eventually installed in Judenplatz in Vienna.
Yes, eventually, yes. After I think the whole thing took about 5 years, and then the day that it was opened, it was just extraordinary. Really, my name wasn't even mentioned that I'd made it, and there were all around the rooftops, sort of around here, around the other side, like over that side of the square. There were snipers, so people with guns, and it was just the most terrifying thing I've ever been at. And and anyway, here it is now, sitting in a much more peaceful state. And actually, I thought at the time, because there had been so much sort of right-wing interference, the interior of the piece is full. I got lots of extra pieces of library, so lots of extra books, because I thought we would have to replace them, because I thought it was going to get really, really attacked. But actually it hasn't. People are very proud of it, and they really like it and respect it. And the roof of it, I don't have a picture of it, but the roof of it, there's a ceiling rose. So it's a slight incline on the roof, so that when it rains, and there's a drain pipe that runs through it, so that through the ceiling rose, and obviously that sort of feels like something else as well. And beneath there's a sort of the synagogue, the original synagogue, or parts of the original synagogue, and this is a Jewish study center. So it's a rather beautiful sort of connection, and it works very, very well.
Yeah. I think about 1 year later, you were invited to make a piece for the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square.
Yes, I think that's what we've got next, is it?
It was in 2001. So
yes, there we are. There it is. You're right. So the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, this was actually, Trafalgar Square is now, it's become a pedestrianised site, a place. It's very different to when I made this piece. And when I went there, and I was, I'd been asked if I would think about doing something. It wasn't actually a commission. It was, I had to raise the money for it, and it was, they just said, "Oh, you can do it." It's, yeah. So that's all changed now as well. But when you do things for the first time, anyway. So when I went to the site, there's the National Gallery at one end, and the National Portrait Gallery, and then there's Nelson's Column and the lions and things. But there was also this road that ran all the way around it, and there were red buses and taxis and traffic and bicycles and all sorts of stuff going on, sort of chaos of London.
South African Embassy too, I remember.
Oh, the South African Embassy, yes, exactly, yeah.
Were always protesters in front of it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It was always a place where people would go to protest. And, as a kid, I used to go there and protest there and all sorts of things. So, it was a place where I thought, well, what can I do here? And I decided that I wanted to make a sort of pause. I wanted to make this quiet moment. So that's what I did. So it's like the biggest, heaviest resin cast ever made. And it was quite a feat to do it. And there it is.
Great. I would like to go back for a second to torso, because I do remember you said to me once that you use that often to test materials. Is that correct?
Indeed, yes, it is. I think there's an image a bit later on of, no, there isn't actually, we took it out. But it's something that I've always done. Is I've always had hot water bottles sort of around, and it's sort of something that maybe if I'm using a lot of material and I've got too much, I'll just pour some into a hot water bottle. It's just like having a mold. But each one is completely individual. So the first one was a very different shape to this. This one, it almost has like this, it's almost like a backbone or a sort of breastplate, or it could be, so they're very sort of anthropomorphic objects. And I've made them in resin, in concrete, in plaster. I've silver leafed them. I've done all sorts of different things with them. So there are a number of these objects, but they're it's something that I use to, and I still do it occasionally. And they're always, when they have the material in them, I sort of shape them and do something with them to just give them their own sort of presence.
In 2005, I think you did the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern.
Yeah.
And again, a very tricky space. I remember the magnitude of the installation. What I didn't know at the time was how personal the piece was for you.
Yeah. So here is the piece. And so I don't have a picture of the actual box in this, but my mother had died, and we were clearing out her house, and I found a box in the basement that was a box that was it originally had held sellotape, and it was a box that we had had for, it must have been throughout my entire childhood, and it had sort of various different things that had been in it were written on the side and crossed out, and then there was sort of Christmas decorations crossed out, and books crossed out. And I had this object, and it was beautiful graphics of the original sort of sellotape graphics, and I felt very attached to it, and I didn't know why, and I just had it in the studio, and I was just sort of pinned to the wall. And I just started thinking about the Turbine Hall and thinking about what I could do. And I just felt that, what I wanted to do was just to use this as a kind of idea of building a place, of things, of people, of stuff. And I was thinking about films, and, I was thinking about scenes from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and, all sorts of stuff that, all sorts of different cultural references. But essentially, and I'd also been to, whilst I was thinking about it, I went to the Arctic and stayed in the Arctic for 2 weeks. And so that had I was thinking about that at the same time. So I was sort of thinking about environment and all of these things, but it did originally stem from my mother's, a box from my sort of family life or my childhood. But all sorts of things happened with this. And it was, I had young children at the time, and I was doing quite some sort of playful things in the studio, and I sort of loved the idea of small children going in here, and kind of nightmare for a parent, but they were all running through, and they'd go around and they'd hide behind things, and it was a sort of very playful thing, and I was just looking for a way of making something that felt playful rather than just this incredibly kind of serious thing. And actually at Christmas there was all these people dressed as Santa Claus ran in and did a sort of little event in there. So, it was certainly playful.
I remember kids loved it. I remember that.
Yeah.
I'm going a bit back and forth here. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about, again, the Holocaust piece in Vienna. And one of my favorite pieces of yours is the stairway that you made. Oh, there it is, in your studio, I believe. Because you moved to an actual synagogue, ex-synagogue for a while.
Ex-synagogue, yeah. So there was a period when we found this really big building in the East End of London, and which was a sort of completely anonymous building. That I'd lived in the East End for decades, and I'd never seen this place. It was very near Brick Lane, and now, now that part of London is just, this sort of crazy, trendy area. But at the time, it was just prostitutes and, all sorts of...
The heritage of the craze was still there.
The craze and, and all sorts of things going on. So when we got there, and there was 2 apartments on the top, and there were 3 staircases in the building. And I decided to cast all 3 staircases, and this is one of them. So it's a staircase, and it's turned, if you sort of flip it up the other way, you can see, it's like a bit like a sort of Chinese puzzle. It's very hard to understand how it's made or how we got out, but it is actually from an actual staircase. And, there's a patina on the stairs here, and there's tiles and things. But they're quite, they're sort of interesting, I think, for me in terms of objects and making something which I then, by turning it slightly or by doing something else to it, it gave you a sort of a visual conundrum, which is, again, a different sort of, aspect of the work. But around that time, I was also making lots of doors, and these doors that were sort of kind of in and out. I called them in and out, and they were all sort of cast back, and then they sort of have got the opposite on both sides, and you have to kind of see them to understand what I mean. But and with these, you can sort of look through them and you can see the back and the front at the same time. And then also I was casting with windows and resin, and I get quite obsessed by things. So tables were quite an obsession at the time. So these were all cast from tables, and they're all made in concrete.
Mm-hmm.
And,
doors. There you go. Yeah. My next question was about, were you aware of Marcel Duchamp's windows when you start making your doors, and the concept of access to a space that you cannot actually get in?
Yes. Yeah. Of course I was. Yeah. I mean, I was very much, the kind of people that I was, Duchamp I've always, admired enormously, but he's never really an artist that I've thought of as an influence,
Especially because he works with ready-made, whereas you.
Yeah, exactly. I've always, there's a lot of artists have worked with doors, and they still do. But there was something that I was trying to, and I still do make doors. There are things that still, by using this sort of resin and getting this kind of inside-outside thing, and I think there it can be incredibly sort of beautiful and evocative, and also very minimal. And they can feel very personal, but they can also feel very sort of minimal things, which are, again, it was something like this, which is, you could think, oh, that's very much like a Carl Andre, but when you look at the surface of it, this area here was where, in the synagogue, where the Torah was read from. So that is the, just where the piece of, the whatever I can't think what you call it, the furniture that the Torah was held, and then around here, this was all the sort of traces of where the lino had come up and stuff. So I've always, and this came from, I suppose, having cast the synagogue and having cast parts of the synagogue, but also with the Holocaust Memorial, and looking at Jewish heritage, and all of those sorts of things.
Shy sculptures, I would love to talk about them. Presumably you call them shy sculptures because of the gentle way they position themselves within the landscape. We're seeing one here. That's the one you made in Svalbard, I think, the fish boat.
Yes. So this is sort of in Norway, just outside of Oslo. Okay. And this was the first piece that I made. So really, after having had many years of, I just everything I did seemed to cause some sort of controversy. And I was trying to work in a way that was much quieter, and wanting to make things that you would find in the landscape. And really, it was a big, big journey to get there, and all of these places. So there's this, which is a boathouse which was cast onto a fjord, which, in the winter, this completely freezes, and it sits in sort of ice and snow, and in the summer it sits in water.
This is that's the one you made in Joshua Tree.
Yeah, so this is made in Joshua Tree, and in the Mojave Desert. And
I remember, isn't this the first piece where you actually have to delegate somebody else?
Yes. So this piece was actually made by somebody else. I'm trying to do another one at the moment in Japan in the same way. So it's completely made by other people. So I'm sort of trying to do it remotely, as it were. And this, this is a sort of very successful one that was made that way.
And you were happy with the way it turned out?
Yes, it was, beautiful. I was really happy.
And it must have been interesting for you to go to see the piece after it was
done. Exactly. It became very, it was very emotive, actually. I went there with my kids, and we did a trip to the desert, and my husband.
The one we're seeing now is the one you made in Governor Island in New York City.
It is indeed, which is, just over here on this, that's where the Statue of Liberty is. And over here is the site of the World Trade Centers. And when 9/11 happened, I was asked to think about trying to sort of think about doing some sort of memorial. And I just flatly just said, I'm not even going to think about it. It's still something that's happening. It can't be digested that quickly. It's really such a tragedy, and obviously still is. And so I just said, no, I didn't want to think about it at all. But much later on, Tom Eccles, who now runs Bard College, he was at the Public Art Fund, and previously I'd done the water tower with him, and he asked me if I would do something on this place called Governor's Island, which was just off Manhattan. You'd have to take a ferry over to it, and it was this island that was used as a customs stop, and it's now been turned into this big park. And when I went to see it, the island was just blank, really, and there were lots of buildings and things, but I just decided I wanted to use this particular site because I wanted the view of 9/11 and I wanted the view of the Statue of Liberty. And I made this piece, which is the first invented hut that I made. So it's completely invented this. I made it in London. We made a mold in London, and we shipped it over and craned it onto the site. And I was thinking about the Unabomber at the time.
Wow.
And other such people.
Yeah. And what about, this is the one you made for Tate Britain.
Yeah, so this is another Shy sculpture that was made for Tate. I'm just aware of the time where, so this was another Shy sculpture.
Yes, and this is the one you made in Yorkshire, the Nissan hut.
Yes, so this is cast from a Nissan hut. So this is a very large structure and sits in a forest. So all of these places, apart from obviously the one at the Tate, which it's not there permanently, but all of these pieces are really, they have you have to take a journey to get to them, and that's the journey is very much a part of seeing them. So it's not something that you can readily just see. It's more complicated than that.
The very first exhibition I got to see after the pandemic, well, I mean, the pandemic's still on, obviously, but when things started slowly going back to normal, whatever that means, one of the first exhibitions I went to see was your show at Gagosian, Internal Objects, and I was deeply impressed, as you can imagine, because it, as the word says here, it felt a bit like a departure from everything that I thought I knew about your work up until that point.
Yes. So I knew that I wanted to make the opposite of what I'd always been making. And I didn't really know what that was, but I just kept saying, what's the opposite? What's the opposite of what I've been doing? How can I make something that's the opposite? And I had these two pieces of wood, and I kept painting them and painting them and painting them. And I just had those on the wall, and I was just thinking, well, they're kind of the opposite. They sort of feel like something. I'm still not sure what it is. Gradually, I started to build something, and I was thinking about it was almost like making a kind of collage or a sort of drawing in space. And I was using lots of elements that I found. And a lot of this, I'd been to the desert to see my piece at Joshua Tree, and I was thinking about cabins. And I finally made, I made two pieces, but we're just going to talk about this one. This one was called Poltergeist. And obviously it has a reference to Ghost, which was one of the first sculptures that I made. And it's a hut which you can't walk into. You can just see from the outside. It has the floor. I can't remember let me just check the images I've got. It has a floor and lots of different sort of aspects to it, but essentially a lot of it is this corrugated iron which has been painted, and everything is just painted and painted white. And some of the corrugated iron is rusted so much that it almost feels like lace. But I wanted to get the sense that it felt like there's something inside it, and it was or somehow something had happened to it, and it had kind of exploded but sort of imploded at the same time. And at the same time I was making these other works. These are similar to pieces that I've made using cardboard, but these are actually cast in bronze and then hand painted. So that's sort of what I'm doing, a lot more sort of hand painting using paint on things. And it just feels for me like there's been a big kind of departure in the work.
Right.
Yeah, this is a notice board. This is like a window, but it's essentially a notice board. And on that you can see these, if you look online, you can find these things and look at them in more detail, but they have this kind of very discrete sort of pattern on the surface, which have come from what would be pins, drawing pins and bits of paper. And it's a sort of something that's against the digital age in a way, I suppose.
Right. Right. Well, you just mentioned drawings, and I think it would be interesting to learn more about your drawings. And I know that you've been collecting postcards for a long time and perforate them and painting them.
Yeah, well, I do. I mean, this is where I'm sitting now, and this is the studio that I have. That is it's very much my private space, and it's where I do a lot of drawing and things that are connected to my work. And I've always made drawings, lots of them, throughout my entire career. And it's a way of sort of doodling, but it's also a way of thinking through things and trying to understand what I'm going to make next and how I'm going to possibly do it. But another thing that I've done always is, and often when I'm away on trips, I will buy postcards and hunt them out. And often, depending on where I am and if I've driven there rather than I've got on an aeroplane, I'll take sort of a little punch set with me and a hammer, and I will sort of do these as just sort of things to do whilst I'm away.
How many do you have of those?
I don't know. A lot.
A lot.
I just, this is from when I lived in Berlin in 1993. I don't remember where this one's from. But
have you ever exhibited them?
Yes, I have. I had sometimes in shows. There'll be a few of them alongside a show, but never a big exhibition of them. No. But I did actually in the drawing show that I did it was at the Tate and the Hammer.
Your mother, Pat Whiteread,
yes.
She was an artist, and she was actually one of a very seminal exhibition, Women's Images of Man, at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London in 1980. And I guess it would be, I'm curious to know if she was an influence consciously or subconsciously. I think, well, I thank you, Michele, for sort of bringing this up and asking me to talk about her, because it was actually a very lovely thing to do, to be able to think about it. Yeah, she was an artist, and she had always made art throughout my entire, from when I was very small, she always had a studio. And when we sort of lived in London after moving from what was then the sort of countryside, when I was 7 years old, she had a studio in the basement of our house. And from there, she made her work all the time. But she was also involved with a group called the Women's Art Alliance. And they decided to make an exhibition called Women's Images of Men, which was selected from our basement when I was sort of 15 or 16 years old. And I was I wasn't doing art at all at that time. I decided when I was doing my O-levels, as they were, I just didn't even do art. I just didn't want anything to do with it. And I realized as I was sort of watching this happen and unfold that I'd kind of made a mistake, and I was actually really interested. But here it's just very interesting to see from the sort of archive that the people, so there's Sir Sandy Nairn, who ended up being, a director of the National Portrait Gallery. This is Ivona Blaswick, who is now a director. Original spelling of her name.
Yeah, and another guy, a person called Steve White, who's a very well-known photographer who photographs everybody's artwork. So these were all people that I knew and were in my basement when I was a kid. This is my mum. This is Sandy Nairn, looking very, very young. And these are a number of the artists that were involved with the exhibition. So, you know, it was a very interesting time just watching this go on in our basement, because, you know, everybody was arguing and excited and, you know, competitive and, you know, all these things going on, all in a smoke-filled room with slide projector and me at the back and going off and making them coffee and just looking in amazement at some of the work was truly awful, I must say. And even then I knew it was awful. But they did this selection and came up with the work. And, you know, it was a sort of, you know, as you say, a sort of seminal exhibition. And here we have it showing that the higher fee for the exhibition was £300. And there was another exhibition and there was, you know, this was, you know, Arnold Feeney, Blue Coat Gallery, you know, these were interesting places, Third Eye Centre, they were all very interesting galleries. And the other exhibition, which is About Time, which was with people like Susan Hiller in it, as well as my mother. And this was a video performance, and that one you could hire for £150. I don't know why it was so much cheaper, because it was much more complicated with the technology putting it up.
Yeah, I mean, that's
yeah.
Yeah. And you have some images of your mom's work.
Yeah, so yes, and so but she made sort of photo montages and projected images and things that went on light boxes. And she would do, so this guy here, he was called Metaphysical Man, and he was made from one of those sort of wooden artist dolls, you know, that you use for doing figurative paint, you know, figurative drawing. And she made a sort of asbestos suit for him, and then she would do these sort of images which was sort of dissolved on the screen by using sort of slide. It was very, very early sort of technology, which now you can do digitally very, very simply. But at the time it was projectors and celluloid and, you know, all sorts of different stuff. And this was a piece that was also another, these are still images from what was a slide tape. And, you know, what is so interesting about it, I think, is how sort of prophetic the work was, and how during, you know, the time now, you know, what we see now, what's happening in the world. And this was called Explosive Expenditure, and it was called From Rigor Mortis Pollution Piece B. So obviously there's, you know, an oil rig and a diver, and there's oil spills and fire, and you know, so that there were things like I think the Imoko could, you know, there'd been some very, very big environmental disasters, and she, you know, she was sort of thinking, you know, big oil spills and things from tankers, and she was sort of thinking about all of this stuff. Devastating greed. I mean, you know, we now have a petrol shortage in the UK. I mean, it's just, you know, and yes, I think they're very beautiful images as well as kind of interesting images.
That's you, I guess.
And that's me there. And these are my twin sisters. And this was on Lake Windermere in the Lake District, and we were rowing very earnestly by the looks of it. And she, I think, you know, she was at the end of the boat, obviously taking the picture. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, I mean, I could go on forever, but sadly our time is up. Maybe there is time for a couple of questions from the audience. Most of them are compliments, Rachel.
Oh,
but which is nice. Well, there's a question from Sarah Lowley. Is touch an important way for you to experience your work, especially when you're making something tangible out of something that isn't there?
Is touch an important? Well, it's very much, it's very important for me when I'm making it. And actually, you know, that one of the things about having that sort of departure in my work was that I really wanted to make it all myself. Again, I didn't want to do it with anybody. I had one assistant, and this was making it through the sort of pandemic as well. But I just decided that I really just wanted to be completely hands-on myself, and not. I work with two people really. There's a guy who used to be my assistant, and he now has his own business, and I go to him to make things, and he does it in a studio somewhere else, and then I have a studio where I kind of make things myself. And generally, I much prefer to do it myself and have the sort of touch, the physical touch of making it myself. And then, you know, I would love it if people could touch the work, but it doesn't really work like that anymore. You know, when something's up, people get very upset if you touch it. So, but yeah.
There's an interesting question from Nora Young about negative space. Can you expand on how this has stayed with you as a thread and what fascinates you about it?
So again, I couldn't understand.
Sorry, yes, negative space. Can you expand on how this has stayed with you as a thread?
Stayed with me. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just looking at the sort of unseen and trying to sort of make a sort of presence of the sort of forgotten in a way, and the places that people don't notice and see. And, you know, it still stayed with me. I think it's just an interesting, you know, sculptural sort of place, you know, space. I just, yeah, it feels like it's a place that I've discovered and I continue to discover it. And it, for me, it can be very architectural, it can be very minimal, it can, you know, all sorts of things that can be.
And it carries the metaphor, of course.
And it carries, yes, of course, yeah, and it carries the metaphor. Yes, thank you. I'm running out of words, sorry.
Well, our time is up, sadly. So thank you so much for your time. It was fascinating to listen to you talking about your work. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Sorry for all the people who asked questions that we weren't able to address, but please join us for the Center's next online artist conversation on Friday, October the 22nd at 12 p.m. with artist Moses Quincan in conversation with Christine Czechinska, the senior curator, Africa Diaspora at Textile and Fashion. Thanks again, Rachel. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. And yeah, have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.